If the world was ending tomorrow, what would you do about it? Final Fantasy VII poses you with this question from the very start, and you struggle against it whilst living in a world in complete turmoil. Whereas some RPGs were set in different times or fantasy worlds, with oppressive monarchs seeking more power as the main villains, this one presents you with the possibility that it might not just be kings in a distant past that pose a threat to life itself. You fill in the shoes of Cloud Strife, a mercenary hired to blow up a reactor from a power plant, owned by a company that provides for the people living in the same city as you do. And even though you are forced to take on missions to progress with the game, it constantly makes you feel bad for the people you are affecting. This was possibly the most morally grey game that was ever made up to its time. And yet, just like Leigh Alexander says, in 1997 I was in high school, and it absolutely did not matter whether Final Fantasy VII was good or not. It was the place I had been waiting forever to escape to. You are slowly introduced to the single most innocent person in the world, a simple girl selling flowers in an otherwise industrialized and ugly city. You take her out on dates, hear her opinions, protect her from evil, and you start feeling like you actually know this fictional character, Aerith, the flower girl. And then out of nowhere, just like death itself so many times, she gets taken from you, killed by the game's antagonist. Because of the impact this scene had on a generation of players, I will analyze and deconstruct it to see where Final Fantasy VII was so right, when so many other games that have attempted to do the same thing have gone wrong. What has made this game stand the test of time, keeping players returning to the planet? Why do people still talk about this game? Is it the story, the music, the visuals? Maybe all of these together. Or perhaps it's what we don't know, what Sakaguchi leaves to interpretation, since it makes each journey seem more personal. Final Fantasy VII is a confusing game, and one that is filled with dread. Cloud Strife isn't your typical hero, he is actually nothing but a confused man. You can't say that video games grew out of pinball, but you can assume that video games wouldn't have happened without it. It's like bicycles and automobiles. One industry leads to the other, and then they exist side by side. But you had to have bicycles to one day have motor cars. In 1997, Squaresoft had developed a reputation as a producer of high-quality role-playing games, and Hironobu Sakaguchi was one of their content creators. He had already made 3 games that sold exceptionally well, but he himself was not impressed by them. He had become bored with game design, and in a final effort to get more excited about his work, he decided to switch genres and work on a game that was more interesting to write. The only person you had to go at the time was the president of the company, and he didn't really understand games that well. Selling him on the concept of an RPG wasn't that hard. I just went up and said, I want to do an RPG. He said, is that good? Is that interesting? And I said, yeah, it's fun. So he said, okay. The video game began with perhaps the harshest restrictions encountered by any nascent visual medium in regard to graphic representation. This presented itself as a huge problem for all RPG makers and lovers. You see, RPGs depend on the story more than they do on the gameplay. And if you can't get yourself immersed in the story because of low graphics, then you can forget about the role-playing games. And as such, the American audience was never as interested in RPGs as was the Japanese. Although Squaresoft had a loyal US following, sales were not as high as the company officials had hoped, and because of that, they did not release Final Fantasy V in the United States. Only the first 4 installments of the series were released in the US, with Final Fantasy V and VI being Japan exclusives due to bad sales. So for Final Fantasy VII, Sakaguchi tried a different approach, a movie with interactivity. Yet with this idea came some problems.
As a result of using a lot of motion data plus CG effects in still images, it turned out to be a mega capacity game. And therefore, we had to choose the CD-ROM as our media. In other words, we became too aggressive and got ourselves into trouble.
Nevertheless, Final Fantasy was born and was already entitled one of a kind all over the world. Let's get a grip of the story. Cloud is a hired mercenary working for an eco-terrorist group called Avalanche alongside Barrett, the group's leader, as well as Tifa, his childhood friend. The game begins in the middle of one of their raids, this time on a Mako reactor owned by Shinra, the company that rules the city of Midgar where they all live. Mako here is seen as a very powerful energy substance that allows people to use magic as well as run all the machines Shinra have at their disposal. Pumping this out of the earth is destroying the planet, however, and Avalanche is trying to prevent it. The reactor ends up exploding and Cloud drops down into Midgar's slums, where he is found by Aerith. Meanwhile, Shinra learns the location of Avalanche's hideout and subsequently destroys it by dropping the upper plate of Sector 7 on top of it, killing its population and also showing you just how little they care for their citizens. Sephiroth, a legendary soldier hero who was presumed dead several years ago, commits mass murder at the Shinra Corporation, though why he did this remains a mystery. The party leaves Midgar and pursues Sephiroth across the planet until he finally reveals his plan. If he manages to open a massive wound on Earth, then the planet itself will gather a lot of Mako energy in an attempt to heal the wound, thus enabling him to merge with it and be reborn as a god. Aerith decides to stop Sephiroth on her own, following him to an ancient city. The party is just behind her and eventually finds Aerith praying to the planet for aid, but just as they reach her, video games allow the viewers to engage actively in the scenarios presented. Adolescents are temporarily transported from life's problems by their playing. They experience a sense of personal involvement in the action when they work the controls, and they perceive video games as not only a source of companionship, but possibly as a substitute for it. This is the biggest reason for this scene's impact in the video gaming industry. It was the first to introduce the player to the world of loss outside of reality. We were used to having all of the power, choosing the party we wanted, dating the girl we wanted, going wherever we wanted, and out of nowhere, a fully developed playable character is just gone. In this shot, we can perfectly see the personification of evil, with Sephiroth being in the shadows and Aerith in front, perfectly illuminated, representing all that's good about the planet. It is the perfect shot of darkness triumphing over light. Another interesting use of color is when Cloud is laying her in the pool. The tones of blue almost remind us of heaven, where we can all assume Aerith is going to, religious or not, because it is perfectly clear that there is such a place in this world of Final Fantasy VII. In terms of character models, visual theorist Scott McCloud has written about the abstract nature of cartoon characters and how the lack of detail in characters allow viewers to identify with them, because it encourages the viewer to position himself in or as the character. Cloud is nothing more than a few squares put together in the abstract shape of a body. The game even allows you to rename him at the beginning, making it your story completely. Sure, he has some specific features about him like blonde hair and blue eyes, which isn't very typical, but we feel in his shoes nonetheless and can't help but feel the blow that was losing Aerith ourselves. The fact that music plays an important role in the overall experience of video gaming is widely accepted, but just how far it can go has never been properly evaluated. One thing is for sure though. In particular, music in video games can serve to enhance a sense of presence, cue narrative or plot changes, act as an emotional signifier, enhance the sense of aesthetic continuity, and cultivate the thematic unity of a video game. In this scene, we hear Aerith's theme, or her leitmotif. A leitmotif is a musical theme that becomes associated with a character, object, emotion, or idea. So far, we had heard this song every time Aerith entered the scene, and with her being such a jolly character, we associate the song to happiness. But now, we are witnessing her death, and along with her going into the depths of that river, goes our happiness as well. Although the function of sound effects is primarily atmospheric, pitch, volume and tempo of sound effects can strongly affect our responses to any given noise. High-pitched sounds are often used in suspense sequences, particularly before or during the climax. And can you hear that? Akira Kurosawa said it all. Cinematic sound is that which does not simply add to, but multiplies 2 or 3 times the effect of the image. Hertz points out something very interesting about video games, and how you're not just playing with colored light, but with the actual concept of death. But so far, you'd die, watch all of the pretty explosions, and after the fireworks display and the game over screen, you'd get to press the reset button and you'd be alive again. Except this time, pressing the reset button doesn't bring Aerith back. The input-driven nature of film makes it easy to cue strong passive emotions that could even lead up to crying. In contrast, video games are based on acting out the emotions. This, together with the fact that we are totally subdued to immersion in this game, provides for a scary outburst of emotions when catharsis is present. According to Janet Murray, immersion is a metaphorical term derived from the physical experience of being submerged in water. We seek the same feeling from a psychologically immersive experience that we do from a plunge in the ocean or swimming pool. The sensation of being surrounded by a completely other reality, as different as water is from air, that takes over all of our attention, our whole perceptual apparatus. And Final Fantasy VII is the perfect immersion experience, one that was like no other in 1997 when the game came out, and took the breath out of players all around the globe. For the purpose of this analysis, let's assume that Final Fantasy VII is an interactive movie. It has cutscenes, characters, dialogue, a plot, and a story. The great majority of video games are designed for children or young adults, and it is widely believed that stories help children to learn and to memorize information. They also seem to offer children life lessons and serve as a sort of preparation for adulthood and for the physical and emotional upheavals life will make them face. Vladimir Propp came up with 31 functions of narrative that almost all children's fairy tales follow, and I would like to try and apply them to Final Fantasy VII and see where it differs. 1. Member of the family leaves home. 2. Prohibition or rule is imposed on the hero. 3. Rule is broken. 4. Villain makes an attempt at reconnaissance. 5. Villain learns something about his victim. 6. Villain tries to deceive the victim to get possessions of his belongings. 7. Victim helps the villain by being deceived or influenced. 8. Villain harms the member of the family. 9. This lack or misfortune is made known, and the hero is given a command or sent on a mission. 10. The seeker plans action against the villain. 11. The hero leaves home. 12. The hero is attacked and receives a magical agent. 13. The hero reacts to the actions of the future donor. 14. Hero uses the magical agent. 15. Hero is transferred to the location of the object of his mission. 16. Hero and villain join in direct combat. 17. Hero is branded. 18. Villain is defeated. 19. Initial misfortune or lack is set right. Number 19 is where we have some trouble. Since we have already established that Final Fantasy VII is an interactive movie, we can debate a fact. The ending of a movie is a culmination of the spectator's absorption as all the gaps get filled. The initial misfortune is indeed set right, but the hero does not come home after that. Final Fantasy VII has what most people would call an open ending because of how little detail we are given about the future of the planet. One of the reasons why it was so big was because of how many plot holes were left open or unresolved, and this caused an uproar in the fanbase community. The rise of the internet enabled fans to embrace a collective intelligence for information, interpretations, and discussion of complex narrative that invite participatory engagement. The fact that the ending was left up to the player's interpretation caused for its continuous upbringing when debating certain controversial video games in the next decade. It was, however, a very risky move on Square's behalf, but we already know that Sakaguchi's purpose in switching to RPG was indeed to try different things and not focus so much on profit. Helen Fulton describes the consequence of the economic structure in the film industry's narratives as having to fit a standard pattern and a set of expectations. By choosing not to fit this standard stereotypical pattern, it brought him and his game a fame that he probably wouldn't have gotten otherwise, seeing as how the rest of the story of the game is fairly typical, with some technical flaws alongside it.
映画が1時間から2時間ぐらいですけども、見ていて非常にのめり込みますから。
It is easy to get emotionally involved with both films and games, although in different ways. Adding certain interactive aspects to films, however, I believe that players can get further into them, even become one with the visual images. I have always emphasized visual and sound effects because rather than making my games equivalent to films, I want my games to surpass films. That is my goal.
A film is mostly experienced as a unique sequence of events, and we do not learn the physical outlay of a given simulated world very well. We are carried from space to space. In everyday life, however, we repeat the same actions over and over in order to gain mastery. When we arrive to a new city or a new building, we slowly learn how to move around, and if we want to learn to drive or bike, we exercise those skills until we have acquired the necessary procedural skills. The video game experience is very much similar to such an everyday experience of learning and controlling by repetitive rehearsal. Aerith's death scene was so impactful because it devastated players that filled in the shoes of Cloud Strife. The immersion up to that point was already so in-depth that people actually missed an imaginary inexistent character from a video game. Music, scenario, the character models, and the plot all lined up to make you feel like Cloud didn't exist anymore. The weight of the whole world was on your shoulders. It was you who felt the rage against Sephiroth, and it was you who lost Aerith. Movies can make you cry, but video games, in other words, interactive movies, they can make you grieve.